Good afternoon, everyone. Assessments of the conservation status of species provide a litmus test of how our flora, fauna and ecosystems are changing in a rapidly changing world. Today I want to give you a glimpse at a few aspects of a project that has been reviewing the status of South Australia's native plant species. This project has been coordinated incredibly efficiently by co-author Sharon Gillam, assisted by many botanical experts from around the state, including co-author Peter Lang from the State Herbarium. So today I'm wanting to present some very preliminary results for a statewide assessment of all of the native plant species that are documented. It's the first time that this has happened in this way for all vascular plant taxa. It's based on an initial 7-year regional species status assessment project that Sharon also coordinated, and that was followed by a statewide assessment over the past year. In all, the statewide assessment has assessed 3,406 native plant taxa. As I said, the results are preliminary, and they're preliminary because the final of many assessment workshops doing the assessments was only held 3 weeks ago. I won't be presenting information about national and state listing processes, very involved, about legislation or about assessments of threats. As background, the regional assessments that were started 8 years ago were done for each of our 8 NRM regions, but because they're based on socio-political boundaries, we opted to do our status assessments at the interim biogeographical regionalisation for Australia's sub-regional scale. Now, just as an example, in that scheme, there are 89 bioregions around Australia, and there are 419 sub-regions, 15 bioregions in South Australia, at least in part, and each of those has between 2 and 6 sub-regions. For both the regional and the state status assessments, the flora data was sourced from the Juna Biological Database of South Australia, affectionately known as BWSA, as well as from the State Herbarium of South Australia Specimen Database, AdHerb, from which the census of SA plants, algae and fungi is generated. The knowledge of the South Australian flora was sourced from that database of herbarium specimens, without which we wouldn't really had anything to base it on. And many people, including knowledgeable naturalists, during the regional assessments, preferably where possible from the local region as well, plus professional botanists and ecologists. The assessment method for both the regional and state assessments based around the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Iucn, Red List criteria and categories, which is an international framework. It sets a common assessment approach for assessment of status of most living organisms, so that in any country in the world we know that we're talking about the same sorts of assessments. For the regional assessments, we applied the Iucn Red List regional criteria. Now, the Iucn Red List has the following categories on the left-hand side here, ranging from extinct in the wild, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, and least concern. And then there are 2 other categories where there's not enough information in one way or another. Data deficient, not enough information, not evaluated. In our case, that was often where there were some taxonomic issues. Now, I've drawn a line there with EPBC on the left. Under the National Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which lists threatened species nationally, they use the categories from extinct down to vulnerable. In South Australia, because our legislation our threatened species lists are embedded in an Act from 1972, all of those first 4 categories on the left are classified under our endangered schedule, even though we are currently assessing using all of the categories. Vulnerable in South Australia equates to vulnerable nationally and internationally. And under our legislation, we have an extra schedule, an extra list for rare, which under Iucn categories equates more or less to near threatened. So just looking at the categories that are used nationally, so extinct down to vulnerable, in red there I've got the state level, state numbers for each of the categories from the last assessment, which was gazetted in 2008. And in blue is the current national listing of South Australia. This is South Australian species only. So you can see that at the national level, they're about a quarter to a third the number that we've actually got listed at the state level at the moment. The regional assessments, based on a regional focus, really help to identify location errors in the biological database of South Australia. Helped identify unusual records that required verification, helped to identify existing data sets that weren't actually already entered into the database, and resulted in the first ever thorough bioregional and NRM regional status assessments of vascular plant species for South Australia using these techniques that built on earlier work that Peter Lang and Darryl Cranbuell had done. The regional species status lists are not legal lists, but rather they're guiding documents for regional planning that have established some baseline measures of current known distributions at the time that those assessments were done. The State Species Status Assessment Project has been, as I said, undertaken over the past year. It's based on the regional assessment results, but applied at a state scale. It also uses the same Iucn methods of assessment. Fortunately, because we did the regional assessments, it's based on a much cleaner, much more thorough, complete database than when we started 8 years ago. And because of those regional assessments, it's also been undertaken by a significant pool of people now experienced in application of the Iucn Red List assessment methods. So what I'm about to present, as I've said, are preliminary results. They're indicative only. There's a lot of follow-up work needing to check on further information for quite a few species. No editing's been done yet, nor peer review. So here's a summary graph for what we've come up with for the whole of the flora. So in orange, the biggest segment there suggests that we've got about 56% of our native plant taxa of least conservation concern. You'll see that about 1% are thought to be extinct, about 1% critically endangered, 4% endangered, 10% vulnerable, 23% rare, and there's a few not evaluated and data deficient, as you would probably expect. I want to just show you how that pattern goes through some of our major plant families. It's a fairly similar sort of pattern for our 277 taxa of grasses, native grasses. None critically endangered, 2% endangered, 6% vulnerable, 25% rare, 60% least concern. Similar sort of pattern for our legumes, 335 taxa of native legumes. Quite a big proportion there are listed as rare, or considered rare, 27%, 10% vulnerable, 2% endangered, 1% critically endangered. The composites or daisies, once again, very similar sort of statistics for 379 taxa. Another large family, the Myrtaceae, the eucalypts and bottle brushes and tea trees, etc. Quite a similar proportion with 165 taxa considered. But then there are the orchids. Very different. And I should point out that, where are we? The orchids are a special problem for conservation. This high proportion of threatened species relative to other groups is probably related to their complex biology in terms of pollination and germination. However, when assigning conservation priorities, we also need to take into account that the orchid taxonomy is difficult, is contentious, and very much still evolving. There's a recent and continuing expansion in the number of taxa that have been formally described and added to the plant census, and others still that have been informally given unpublished phrase names that we somehow need to consider as well. DNA studies, some of which are currently in progress and others about to start up, may show that some taxa may be better grouped as a single variable species or species complex, as has been the case in the overseas studies of the bee orchids, the genus Ophrys in Europe. So, interesting. It's interesting to then look at the current listings of all South Australian orchids in the national lists, in the middle column there, and the current state lists on the right, where you'll see that nationally 48% of South Australian listed threatened plants are orchids. Not 48%, that's 48 individuals, so it's 39%. And 106 of the 383 listed, and this doesn't include rare at the state listings, 106 of the 383 threatened plants listed down to vulnerable, which is 28% of the state listings, are orchids as well. So as you might imagine, it's taken us 8 years to get this far, doing regional assessments, and then as far as we've got with the state assessments. So maintaining currency of lists and assessment processes is a big challenge. Typically at the national level, only between 1 and 3 plant taxa from South Australia are considered every year. In South Australia, because of the way the legislation is set up and the way we need to change the schedules that are embedded in the Act, we tend to do that every 10 years or more. So neither is a good model. So how do you keep current? And I'll cover that, I think, in this next couple of slides. We're very fortunate to have South Australian Seed Conservation Centre with its seed bank. In 11 years, they've collected seeds of 565 of the 797 currently listed threatened South Australian plants, which is 71%. Any of you who know about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has the global plant conservation strategy, the international target by 2020 is to have 75% of threatened plant species protected in Seed Conservation Centre seed banks. So we nearly meet that target. Fantastic effort. They've also collected seeds from more than 2,500 plant species. Many priority threatened species have multiple provenances that have been banked, including more than 350 orchid collections of about 100 species. So another example of how we're trying to address some of the threatened plant conservation issues is focusing on recovery and action plans for as many species as we can. Here I'm only covering the South Australian threatened plants that are listed nationally. And so out of 121, 95 have recovery plans and 8 others have action plans. So that somewhere between 80 and 90% of our threatened plants have some form of action. In some instances, it may only be seeds collected and banked in the seed bank, but that's better than nothing. But a lot of them do have on-ground action as well. The next steps for this project are analysis of the database, fairly big job in itself, and then preparing a detailed report which will detail the methods, summarise all of the status statistics, and will provide some comparisons with previous reviews, which are going to show some interesting trends. That report will then be put out for public comment. Hopefully, the State Species Status Assessment Report, once it's completed, will provide a new baseline from which to consider plant conservation in the state, provide guidance for identifying priority species, habitats and locations for conservation action, and I'm hoping also it will provide guidance for priority assessments and listings at the national scale, inform processes there, and of course it's going to provide indicators of the scale of our increasing challenges to be faced in a period of accelerating climate change. And that is it with those acknowledgements.
Thank you. I'm sure Peter will be happy to answer your questions afterwards.